I'm glad to welcome everybody to this call today. And we've got another new exciting expert to speak to us in our Ask the Expert session. This is the fourth installment of our series, Ask the Experts, and it's been based on sustainability issues. So we're very, very glad to have Robert Allender with us today. And of course, it's a 30-minute session. So this is meant to be a quick fire Q&A session. And today we have Robert speaking on Mastering Scope 3 Emissions, Expert Insights for Effective Management. So Robert will give a quick presentation followed by a Q&A session today. I'd like to invite all of you to introduce yourself in the chat room. And please note that all parties will be muted during Robert's presentation. So please go ahead, use the chat room, tell us who you are and which company you're with, and we'd love to hear from you. All right, without much further ado, and I know 30 minutes is precious for you busy individuals. Robert is our expert advisor with Limlogus and Masters. He is a decarbonization expert and veteran with more than 30 years of experience helping companies with their energy management. Robert is a graduate from Cornell University and has been a director of ERM, or Energy Resources Management in Hong Kong, providing board directors with guidance and education on energy and on carbon management. He is also director at the Hong Kong Association of Energy Service Companies for the last 17 years. Robert is based in Hong Kong, and we are honored to have him join us today. I'm just going to flash his profile just in case you've not received it. Let me just get that up on screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? And hopefully you're able to see Robert's profile here. So please feel free to explore our website as well. There are lots of what we call insights and white papers that we've written over the years. And the last issue on CEOs in Asia Pacific on sustainability will be an exciting read for you. So let's move on to Robert. Robert, we're here to listen to you. We'd love to hear more about what you do and what Scope 3 is about. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Lilia. And let me share my screen and get that started. Takes a little while for some reason. So
perfect.
Yeah, that should be right now. Hope everyone can see that clearly. And yes, thanks for the introduction. And it's very nice to be here and have a chance to interact with all of you on the call. As Lilia said, I have been involved with Scope 3 since it was born. It was born in 1998. That's when the Greenhouse Gas Protocol came up with the definitions of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And just on the very small chance that there's anyone on the call who's not 100% familiar with those, I'm going to just jump ahead to that slide so we can just mention again that Scope 1 is the emissions from operations on inside a company's four walls, so to speak, and Scope 2 is the emissions mostly from purchased energy. In fact, for those of us here in this part of the world where district cooling is not that uncommon, I could point out that when I first read about these scopes, the people who wrote the definitions hadn't thought of district cooling. They only mentioned district heating. So I communicated with them and asked them to remedy that. And Scope 3, those are the emissions from the two ends of the scale, the things that happen before something arrives in a company and the things that happen after something leaves the doors of a company. And most of us will spend our time concentrating with Scope 3 on supply chain emissions, but there are plenty of companies that have to actually be very serious about their customers' emissions due to them. And in particular, companies that, for example, that are selling automobiles or other energy consuming things. But so I'll go back to the beginning now, because I always like to remind everyone that we're actually here for this thin blue line. This thin blue line is our atmosphere. This tiny bit of distance between land and the darkness of space is what keeps us all alive. And we've lived with Goldilocks climate now for thousands of years. But as you'll all know, we're now messing it up. We're messing it up because we're pouring enormous amounts of greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And I also like to point out quickly that this isn't, and so first of all, I will say most of these some of these greenhouse gases come from industrial processes, and some come from methane from waste. A fair bit come from agriculture and land use. When you chop down a forest, you immediately reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's absorbed from the atmosphere. And so equally, you're adding to the amount that stays up there. But as you can see from this chart from the World Resources Institute, 73% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from energy use. And we need to understand when we're thinking about scope 3, it's about energy use. I think 11 or 12 of those 73% are from residential energy use, and the other 61 or 62% are from business energy use or organizational energy use. So it's really very clear what the culprit is and what we need to tackle. I also like to point out quickly that it's not something new. Although we're getting very urgent about scope 3 now, the fact is already back in 1856, a woman in upstate New York in the United States, not a scientist, I guess you would call her an amateur scientist, figured out that burning coal in large quantities, because the Industrial Revolution had already started, burning coal in large quantities would increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and she could calculate that that was going to create some sort of global warming. She managed to find a university professor who partnered with her so she could publish her paper, because she wasn't a professional scientist. So we have a record from 1856 telling us we knew about this. In fact, this was 3 years before the first oil well was, commercial oil well was built in the United States. She was certainly ahead of her time. And I also like to remind people that already back in 1965, this was such high profile knowledge that US President Lyndon Johnson was already telling people that he wanted us to be, he wanted Congress to be tackling the problem because he said carbon dioxide is, what's his used in here? It's altering the composition of the atmosphere. Well, that was kind of an understatement. Let me just take a quick look and make sure that I haven't left anyone in the waiting room, because I was asked to note that, and I'm not finding anyone there. So I hope I haven't missed that. Let me just have a double check. Okay, it looks okay. So, and as I pointed out, these are the scopes that I'm sure if you're on this call, you're well familiar with these now. And perhaps many of you will have seen this graph too, reminding us the orange line is the scope 3 percentage that the World Resources Institute calculated for different industry types. So basically the financial services sector, 100% of their, so close to 100%, it's 100% of their carbon emissions are due to financial services. And many other industries where you would think, oh, well, they're pretty energy intensive, but it turns out, in fact, that still, except for really energy intensive things like making cement and steel, most other industries in metals and mining, for example, even the oil and gas industry, most of their emissions come as scope 3. So it's super important that we understand that this is a high priority. I wanted to just in a couple of minutes talk, share with you some mental models that I use to help people understand scope 3. I give a long talk about these, so I'm going to try to say them in 2 sentences. But I'm not trying to teach you the basics of scope 3 in this little session, but I certainly want to give you the benefit of some thinking which has helped people understand scope 3 in a more clear way. So the first mental model that I share with people is that it's very helpful to think of scope 3 as a progression of phases. Often in a conversation about scope 3, I find people jumping around different parts of these phases without even perhaps recognizing that they are phases, and having conversations about reporting and having conversations about which are their material scope 3 emissions, and having conversations about how they're going to deal with them, and having that kind of mixed understanding isn't too helpful. So I certainly always encourage people to stop and break down their understanding of scope 3 emissions into these 4 phases. I also suggest to people that scope 3, well, scope 1 and 2 have been quite well addressed by many corporations in the world. You'll know that scope 3 is something that's proving a challenge to virtually every single corporation that's required to disclose their scope 3 numbers. And I put it this way, I say, well, scope 1 and scope 2 were things that could be dealt with like a project. I use this graphic. If a company decides to stop burning oil to produce heat and switch to electricity, really it just requires a person in authority to say, take away the boiler and we're going to replace it with an electric heater. And as long as the electricity is coming in carbon free, they've immediately addressed that entire scope 1 problem. And scope 2 can be addressed like that as well. You can make sure that your electricity supply, if you're needing to have clean electricity and you can't have it where your factory currently is, then you probably better think about putting your next factory in a place where clean electricity is readily available. But scope 3 is by definition not a project. It's basically a new way of doing business. It's an almost, for us in this room at least, an eternal new way of doing business. So not a project, a process. And the third mental model that I encourage people to think about is to think deeply about who's pushing for scope 3 recognition, calculation, and disclosure, and to understand the motivation of those parties or the influence of those parties, and not simply assume that, a stock exchange has told a company to do it and the company's told its suppliers to do it, that's enough. It's actually really helpful to understand in much more depth the motivation of the party. So first of all, scope 3 is above all being pushed by governments, because they know if they want their country or their city to survive in the next 50 years, they need to stop carbon emissions. Long-term investors have a particular interest in scope 3 disclosure. And in fact, they were probably the first ones most of us heard about, because they want their investments to be still worth something 20 and 30 years from now. These days, a lot of us are aware that companies' customers and employees and the community at whole and peer pressure are all also pushing scope 3 forward. So understanding the source of this motivation can be really helpful. And some of the regulations and rules that are being written by independent parties, they also have a big influence on how we need to deal with scope 3. Plus, of course, I mentioned these kind of parties such as stock exchanges that are telling us what we have to do. But again, thinking through each one of them, understanding their motivation, writing down what their motivation is today, and what you expect it to be 3 years from now and 5 years from now. These are ways to make really solid decisions about your scope 3 work. And yes, that's certainly true. So hopefully I've done that quickly enough to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Yes, I can look at the clock and see that's okay. So let me right away open the floor and see if anyone would like to challenge anything I've said and call out your alternative opinion. You're certainly entitled to it. And I'm not claiming that everything that I say is the only way of looking at things. And also, if you've got any questions based on your particular needs or requirements in your work position, please go ahead and I'll do my best to answer them. And of course, if I'm not able to answer them and you'd like me to, I'll certainly go off and get people to give us answers. Because the one thing that happens when you've been in a business like this for 25 or 30 years is you get to know a whole slew of experts in various aspects of dealing with Scope 3, and I call on them all the time.
Yes, and thank you very much, Robert. Thank you for the presentation. Of course, you know, it's the richness of your experience, and I hope, you know, even with the Q&A, you'll be able to share some of those experiences that you've had with specific companies or clients. And that's the richness of this conversation. So let me get to the questions now. Everyone, those who've been attending this, you know the drill. If you do have a question, please click on the react button and you will see the little icon that says raise your hand. So please feel free to raise your hand. If you're a little bit shy today, you know, please feel comfortable enough to post your questions on our chat room. And of course, we've got a lot of people on this call who may or may not understand Scope 3, but nonetheless, Robert's here to answer your questions. So please feel free to start engaging in the Q&A sessions. I've had a few questions come in already, and yeah, some of which are going to be quite demanding on you, Robert, but nonetheless, let's give it a shot. What can you do with a single source supplier that is uncooperative in providing Scope 3 data?
Yeah, well,
that's a big question. Yeah.
If you're a company that's required to disclose your Scope 3 data, then this is a challenge you have to step up to. If you're still not to the stage where you're having to disclose, then it's probably a good time to start a dialogue. But if your first report needs to come out on December 31st, 2024, which some Hong Kong companies have to do, or January 1st, 2025, more accurately, then you know, maybe a little bit late to be trying to tackle it in that direction. In my experience, yes, there are single source suppliers to certain things. If you're building something, making something, using some product that's been mined, and it's for example, quite rare or quite difficult to get hold of, and you've placed a 5-year or 20-year order for this product, and suddenly you discover this supplier is not being cooperative in providing the data. Well, happily, there are available in the public domain various metrics. Most of them are government provided metrics for certain things. So if you were trying to determine what 200 tons of iron ore, what the emissions were in producing 200 tons of iron ore in a certain type of mine in let's say the Congo, and the company there wasn't providing you with the data you needed to go into your report, you could find comparable numbers on the internet, and mostly from government entities or from academic entities, and you could use those as a substitute. I would just, as with most things in Scope 3, the best thing is to just make sure that you've explained that in your declarations about your data, which data you've used that came directly from a supplier and which data you've used an open, let's say, a common factor for those for that particular product or that particular service, for that matter. So yeah, it can happen, and of course, even if they've given you the data, you're still left with a question about whether you think it's reliable or not. So guess what? It's really a good idea to cross-check against those public databases and to see whether the data that you've been given matches that. You know, we've been, as I said, Scope 3 was born in 1997. So we've had plenty of time to build this data up. And now that it's so intensely scrutinized and so forcefully demanded, I think that just honestly, that makes things easier for everybody, because everyone knows the realities, and no one can say, oh, you know, I've never collected this data, or why should I share this data with you? Everyone knows that they need it. And even if some suppliers prove a little bit recalcitrant, there's still ways around it.
So there was another question on compliance. How do you ensure compliance from your business partners in your supply chain? So it goes, you know, it goes towards that reply that you've just given. I suppose there's no penalty at this point in time, but you could write them off your vendor list. I suppose you could at some point review their status on your supply chain, couldn't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we could talk about the Walmart example, because that was the first company that really strong-armed their suppliers. I think in 2007, we're talking about a very long time ago, when Walmart gathered thousands of their top tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers into a big arena in Beijing and got up in front of them. I didn't attend that one in Beijing, but I attended the Guangzhou version of it, which is smaller, but and told them loudly and clearly that there would come a time when companies would get cut off the procurement list from Walmart if they didn't satisfy. In those days, to tell you to make it accurate, they were talking about energy efficiency. They weren't talking about carbon emissions. But of course, the people at Walmart knew perfectly well that's, you know, that's where the carbon emissions were coming from, the energy efficiency or inefficiency. But perhaps I can't say entirely with full knowledge about it, whether they used the term energy efficiency because people could grasp that better, because in those days, nobody knew what Scope 3 was except people who were, you know, really deep in the weeds. But they were very tough, and I should say,
What?
I know that Walmart senior executives not only said that to their suppliers, they had similar conversations with their own employees. They said, this is the way this company is going, and some of you are going to love it, and some of you are going to say, well, okay, let's give it a try, and some of you are going to say, well, this is not the Walmart that I signed up for. And the senior executives told the employees at that time, you may need to find a job somewhere else. So some companies have been pretty tough.
Yeah. I have another questions on life cycle. So what developments have you observed regarding the use of life cycle assessment?
Sure. Well, life cycle assessment is a really interesting process, I guess we should call it. It's been practiced for more than 30 years that I know of. Effectively, it's a way of analyzing every part of it's beyond Scope 3. Scope 3 is looking at the carbon emissions down the supply chain. Life cycle assessment looks at everything down the supply chain, basically from a total environmental perspective. And the interesting thing, I guess, that's emerged recently is that because as the data accumulation that I've mentioned a few minutes ago has become so significantly better in nowadays, the practitioners of life cycle assessment conducting life cycle assessments have been given a golden cup with the data that previously they would have struggled to even estimate, let alone actually get real numbers. And so the process of conducting a life cycle assessment in advance of doing something, building a building, building a factory, starting a transport entity of any description, or post facto, that is doing a life cycle assessment of something that's already existing, is now significantly more accurate than it would have been 20 or 30 years ago. And we can credit the Scope 3 disclosure effort with a lot of that improved accuracy.
Yeah. No, you had a wonderful chart just now about which industries were contributing to carbon emissions. I'd love to see that chart again. And I know there are people in this forum from the education sector, from the finance sector, from real estate as well. And, you know, I don't know if you want to raise any highlights or developments for any of these industries. But before I get to that, this is an interesting question. Is it better to set ambitious Scope 3 reduction targets or to choose targets that will be easier to reach?
Yeah.
For those who are ticking boxes, aren't they?
Well, no, not necessarily, Lily.
Okay.
I give my clients credit when they ask themselves these questions. So that means they're thinking. And, you know, they've realized that there are actually two ends of the spectrum, and they've got to find where along that spectrum that they want to be. And yes, there is a minimum, ticking the box, and there's a maximum, overstretching your ambitions and saying that you're going to be net zero by 2026, for example. But the brain work that needs to go into finding that position that's perfect for your company is good brain work. It's a positive thing for the company to understand its situation and to begin to set itself on a path to reach its numbers. I actually don't have any problem with companies who set relatively easy to meet reduction targets if they do it with the right intention. They do it because, you know, they have a particular goal in some other area that they don't want to damage by putting too much effort into Scope 3, you know, in the next 18 months. And they say, well, you know, after 18 months, we'll go for, we'll invest. The thing that we could say about those companies that overextend themselves, just as likely to not produce the results we want, as well as the companies who super under extend themselves. So again, I think that it's a valid question to ask.
Yes, yes. And I suppose that's one where board directors have to be really critical about, you know, because they're going to be held liable for it. And there's a lot of reporting requirements. As of 1st of Jan next year, Hong Kong companies have to start meeting those requirements.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've got some questions for the SME as well. Where do you advise SMEs to begin in their decarbonization journey?
Okay, well, I definitely advise them to begin with the first phase of my 4 phases that I listed at the very beginning. I advise them to spend a lot of time and effort understanding their emissions. And I think this is now perhaps in 2024, the end of 2024, becoming more the norm, that companies stop and spend some serious time and sometimes some serious money identifying their material emissions. Well, first of all, understanding their Scope 3 emissions, because if they've never done the analysis, why would they have that information at hand? It's a brand new idea, a relatively brand new idea. But on top of that, I think the importance of understanding and prioritizing before worrying about calculating and then having the difficult conversation about disclosing, to say nothing about the most important step of all, which is actually doing the reduction. But spending the time and effort understanding at the beginning will save a lot of tears further on. And I'm sure many of us could imagine companies that have just been very enthusiastic, or some salesman sold them a terrific idea and they began working on something and then found that in fact that wasn't really the most important at all. And I'll give you an example which I found super fascinating. In the United States, there's a very big retailer called Costco. Maybe many of you will have heard of Costco, even if you've never shopped in the Costco store. Costco is a really interesting chain of stores. It sells things in bulk. People drive up in their big American cars and giant American shopping baskets and fill them up and go out because they've got big houses to store their stuff in. So, and you would have imagined, if you'd thought about it, that Costco's biggest emissions were due to the giant shops they have, the giant warehouse-sized shops they have, and the giant fleet of semi-trailers they have shipping this stuff around the United States from warehouse to store and so forth. And I would have assumed that too. But it turns out that Costco's largest emissions as a percentage are due to the fact that the Costco credit card is issued by Citibank, and Citibank, because it has enormous lending to the oil and gas industry, has its own enormous carbon footprint due to that lending, and Costco's percentage of that Citibank total emissions is bigger than the emissions from its shops or the emissions and the emissions from its trucking combined. So how about that? Who would have imagined?
Who would have imagined? Gosh, that would come from complete left wing, if you ask me. Yeah. Could I bother you to bring up that slide? I'm going to ask everybody to post their questions online if they want to raise anything at this point. But that slide on, which industries are contributing most to carbon emissions at the moment, that could give us some realism in this conversation as well.
Yeah. So what this slide is, to be clear, it's the analysis from the World Resources Institute was to identify what percentage of the total emissions are from these industries are Scope 3. And even now I hear a lot of, quite experienced people saying, oh, well, we know Scope 3 is 60 or 70% of the total for most companies. But actually, when you look at this, except for those, bottom 5 industries, it's way more than 60 or 70%. And
could you read out the bottom 5 for us, Robert? Because the screen's a bit small.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Let me think. What have I?
Then we've got one question from Peter.
Yeah. Sorry, what did you ask me about this one?
Could you enlarge the screen a bit? I'll read out the last 5, the bottom 5 industries.
I lost it. Okay. Oops. Up we go. Yeah, okay, I'll read them out for you quickly. So the top one's financial services, and the next one's capital goods. The next one is transport OEMs, and then real estate, and then construction, and then metals and mining. These are the top ones, and agricultural commodities. So all of these, you might think, a layman at least would think, oh, well, many of these industries, transport, real estate, they're buildings, they're using energy all the time. That must be the biggest part of their emissions are their use of electricity or heating oil in a cold climate. But it turns out that no, the analysis now, no one's disputing these numbers. These numbers are now well established as being the fact. So in the case of Hong Kong, of course, we're a financial services center. More than 50% of the Hong Kong economy is from financial services. So those companies are really on the line to deal with their Scope 3 emissions, which come from the people they're lending to, just like the Citibank story I just talked about. Okay, Singapore, this the oil and gas processing businesses in Singapore, even those we can see here, 89% is Scope 3 emissions. So when companies begin the job of identifying and then deciding how to calculate their emissions and deciding exactly what way to disclose their emissions, it's a very significant part of stopping climate change getting any worse. I have to always bite my tongue and never say solving climate change, because I'm afraid that's already long gone.
Yeah. We have run out of time, but we do have one last question. Do you wish to take it, Robert?
Yeah, sure.
Peter asks, what role does innovation and technology play in reducing Scope 3 emissions? And can you provide examples of successful innovations?
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the question, Peter. I guess the first of all, I would say innovation and technology are two different things. And I definitely want everybody who's got any responsibility for dealing with Scope 3, and sooner or later that's going to be every single person on the payroll. I want them to think of innovation not being about technology. I want them to think about innovation being about the way they do things, the way they make decisions, the priorities they put on things, the expectations they have for financial returns, for working on investing in Scope 3 reductions, that kind of thing. Because the fact is that people have been calculating for at least a decade that we already have all the technology we need to stop making the climate, to stop increasing the damage that we're doing to the climate. So we don't actually need any new technology. Yes, we're human beings and we'll continue to develop new technology, and for a lot of people, it's a lot of fun to develop new technology. But the fact is that that's not what we're depending on. We're not waiting for some magical technology to come along to solve climate change for us, to take care of our Scope 3 problems. AI, of course, can help people analyze the data better and identify blockages quicker than they might have otherwise. We're looking at things now from space that we never looked at from space before to help us identify methane leakage in the middle of Azerbaijan, or inaccurate reporting of emissions from oil and gas plants. In particular, I know in northern United States, where they do a lot of fracking, again, that's become quite controversial that information is now available. So that's due to technology. I won't say it's not, but we shouldn't stop ourselves thinking about innovation and keeping it only to the topic of technology.
Mm. Well, thank you again, Robert. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you everyone for coming on this call and asking the questions. We really appreciate you joining us. If you have further interest in what Robert is saying and you want more information, please feel free to reach out to us. We've got all our details on the screen right now, and we'd be happy to answer any of your questions from any of our sessions, really. Thank you again, and have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, that was good.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Robert. So we'll be doing a bit of design on the recording itself, and then we'll distribute it to people. We'll also be using it on our website, so then people can always come back to it if they want to. Okay.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, hopefully. I mean, as you said, it never hurts to put your company name out there, and people know you're doing things, even if they didn't manage to engage with it this time. They know that you're active in the field. So good.
Yes, and we're bringing experts along with us. I mean, we're not experts in everything. We want people to know that we live like a community, and it has to be a community of experts supporting each other and collaborating on this. So that's the intent of building these sessions around all our associates and partners and experts out there.